you need to do this in order to be accepted. If you do not do this, you will not be accepted in the future. Also about this post-accession period, I actually I agree that this is a big problem because there is very weak conditionality after the country is accepted. But it's not. Could this not be like the best medicine? You know, he was talking about this fine-tuning of EU strategy, that political criteria were incorporated into acquis communautaire. Yeah. So couldn't just European Union incorporate more into acquis communautaire? It could have like a direct effect on the countries that are already member states. That's
okay. Okay. First question about the negotiation period. You mentioned the example of Slovakia. This is a very interesting case. There is also a huge debate about the EU role on Slovakia. If the EU had a very important role in producing the change of government, for instance, in 1998, but this is not, the objective here of this lecture. The problem is that, it's true. I'm agreeing with you when you say that during negotiation, the EU told to Slovakia to introduce some reforms, some legislation, some institutional change, and they did it. The problem is that with Slovakia, this was a positive example after Mecha, with Churinda and the two governments from 1998 to 2004. With other countries, it was actually different, because in Slovakia there was the political will, and the real political will to gain the exception, and that's why the reform introduced was very effective in some ways. In other countries, it was not the case. And for the same reason, without political will, without an effective control of reforms, the EU have no instrument to assess if the reforms were implemented. In the Central and Eastern Europe, many reforms were introduced in this period. But one thing is the adoption, the other thing is, for instance, the implementation of reforms. And for the EU, it's very difficult to assess the second stage, the real implementation and the real effectiveness of this reform. Just because of the lack of specific benchmark, and the benchmark were introduced just after the enlargement, so in 2005. And second answer concerning post-accession, it's not the same thing. This is political criteria, it's part of the acquis communautaire, but for the candidate countries. So for the member states, it's not a story. You cannot use those criteria and apply it to the member states. Because candidates and member are completely different fields.
My question was about your statement about the lack of post-accession conditionality.
Yeah, sure.
In fact, I'm referring to the cooperation and verification mechanism for Bulgaria and Romania. Don't you think that, in fact, this conditionality passed through the public alliance that we have in these two countries, first of all? Second, don't you think that the blocking of reforms is a kind of conditionality, which is a part of the CPN mechanism? And third one, we have also the non-Schengen accession of these two countries, which is also a kind of conditionality for the CPN mechanism.
Yeah, sure. CDM mechanism is very, very interesting because, for the first time and for the last time, because for Croatia, there's no CDM, for instance. For the first time, the EU introduced a mechanism to control a member states, actually. The problem is that, as you mentioned, there are some informal way to put pressure, like Schengen, like the European funds. But at the end of the day, these are mainly political tools, decision about Schengen, decision about funds are not regulated by, by a specific procedure. At the end of the day, it's a matter of decision between member states, between the other member states. And so that's why I wrote in my presentation about the political problem of the post-accession. Because in a way, I agree with you that there is some way of, some sort of influence, informal influence. But just because it's informal, it is political,
So we don't want to call it conditionality?
No.
Right. So we have another way of calling it.
Next to the strong conditionality approach, we could say it like that, in the European Union is also preserving the opinion that maybe European Union should also enable access of the states which are not completely fulfilling the political criteria to maybe tie them up to Europe and promote democracy and strengthen protection of human rights and so on, or if it is completely abandoned, maybe because of that's what's happening in the member states of the European Union.
There is still this idea that it's better to have it, a country in negotiation, so under some sort of control, that completely outside the EU. But I think that this is also part of a misconception of the role that EU has to do in this situation, because finally, okay, there is a huge debate on the democratization theory, but finally, democratization is a matter of domestic structure, domestic dimension. So sure, an external actor like the EU can play an very important role, but at the end of the day, the outcome of democratization, so the stability of democracy, the consolidation of democracy, it's above all a domestic problem. So there is still in the EU this idea that it's better to negotiate with the country, even if the country is not completely democratic, even if the country does not fulfill completely the criteria. The question is it useful actually? What is the final outcome of this? But I don't have the answer for this. Yeah.
Is there any commission in the EU who talked about this? If there is a problem with democratic repression?
Yeah, sure. It's very interesting because there's a huge debate actually, even at the European Union level, even inside the EU Commission. It is a silent debate because, it's a very sensible problem, this one. When we talk about democracy within member states, we are touching, the most sensible dimension of democratic policy, of the domestic policy. So that's why, yeah, there is a debate inside the Commission. There is a debate on what's happening, for instance, in Hungary. There is the debate on the CVM, the mechanism of verification. It's very debated just inside the Commission. And I can tell you that the opinion there are very polarized. That is, there are someone who thinks that this is a useful tool. This can be used also for other countries in the future. There are someone who told me that actually it is a nonsense and without sanction, it's very limited and counterproductive. So there is a debate, but this problem cannot be solved by the EU Commission itself. I mean, it's a political problem. So the only solution may be at political level, European Parliament, European Union Council. So the EU Commission, even if concerning enlargement acquired some power, some competencies, remain a technical institution. So in this way, and that's why I wrote my final question. Do we need another crisis? Do we need a stronger crisis? Do we need a very, maybe we, yeah. This can be the case. Just another question.
About criteria and human rights.
Sure.
Problem with all member states, for example, France, and their policy about problems with loans. Can you tell something about this and that policy?
No, about human rights in member states. But I mean, I can answer in a very simple way. It is part of the problem. I mean, human rights is part of the democratic nature of the country. So, human rights is part of the political criteria. It's one of the two dimensions of political criteria for candidate countries. It's sure that human rights is a very sensible, as I said before, is very sensible dimension. So, and the problem, let me say, the problem is still the lack of conditionality, the lack of consensus on specific benchmark, specific requirements that every member state has to fulfill. Yeah, please.
It wouldn't be too much to say that the process of democratization rests entirely on the domestic will.
Not entirely.
So we know it's obvious that political will, the will of political need in the country is what lays the foundation of democracy. However, the way in which they conduct their decisions internally also rests on the influence that comes from external factors. And this is not necessarily, I don't mean directly political. And this isn't necessarily obvious. There are certain channels that are open for us to observe. Or we know that they exist, they have missions, diplomatic conference, and all these channels that exist and they influence directly what happens within the country. It cannot be open because there's the principal debate of sovereignty and so want. But the EU, in a certain way, tries to make it a bit more transparent, at least in without actual happening. I mean, it's still a political decision. There are still channels that influence the decisions, but the European Union is still trying to make it a little bit more transparent. Just like it does. And it's a step forward. I mean,
yeah, you know, this is part of the institutionalization of the enlargement policy. I didn't say that democratization is entirely domestic, but for the most part, it depends on the domestic decision of actors, on the domestic structure. The example of Slovakia is very useful in this case. Slovakia in the 90s, and then just after the change of government in 1998. Before this election, the EU tried to push the major government to, you know, to moderate some behavior and to change some policies, but without any results. You know, if there's no domestic political will, if we have no domestic political actors that are willing to do so, even if we have a strong external pressure, we will have no results. So it's a matter of interaction, you know. And in this interaction, there are two sides: the European side and the domestic side. The domestic side is the most important side.
Question. You said that if there is no domestic will, then the change is impossible, basically. But what about
impossible or limited?
Yeah, limited, yes. But if we look at the case of Latvia, for example, there was a strong will. Well, the European Union was pushing to proposally for the rights of the national minorities. So these would be implemented in Latvia, but well, there was short-term will. So before the accession, of course, they implemented everything, but exactly in the moment as they actually got into the EU, they again changed these rules, basically, to the rules they had before. So does this show as well that maybe there is a limited also influence of the conditional?
Yeah, sure.
Of course.
This is another factor showing the limitation of the EU strategy during the enlargement. I mean, this is one of the reasons. This is one of the reasons that pushed the EU just after the end of negotiations with Latvia, but with the most part of Europe in 2004, that pushed the EU to change something to this process of fine-tuning, you know, to adaptation, to the introduction of new benchmarks, new tools. In some way, tentative to strengthen conditionality. This is the problem. This was a problem with Romania and Bulgaria. This is the reason because you introduced the CDM. Other questions? Yeah, sure.
Yeah, look at this CPM. Don't you think that the conditionality is not the best approach of dealing with the new members? Because once you put a conditionality for a country, once they get in, they reverse the whole situation. So don't you think that adopting structural reforms should be the best approach instead of adopting strong conditionality, which doesn't work after the country becomes a member of the EU?
So you are talking about
instead of adopting strong conditionality, measures for conditionality before countries become, don't you think it's better for EU to push for more structural reform instead of
structural reform before the accession
instead of using conditionality?
This would be the best solution. I mean, this this is the case. This is what's happened. I mean, with the conditionality of the EU, the conditionality is just, you know, a condition for the accession, and the condition has several requirements. Structural reform is part of this requirement. But we are still in the same situation. We have still this problem of effectiveness of real change. I mean, how can the EU can be sure that the structural reform were implemented and effective? You know, this is still the same problem. Functionality before the accession. I don't know if I answered your question.
And post-accession as well.
Yeah. Any more questions?
Do you think that we should consider the decision of the European Commission and the European Council obsolete with regards to obsolete with regards to the democratic criteria and the political criteria? I'm thinking about Cyprus now. I mean, what political considerations were taken into account when Cyprus was accepted, considering the fact that being accepted into the European Union practically froze an ongoing conflict. Not conflict, well, froze the situation. Yeah.
Yeah, this is another, also in the case of Cyprus, you see how political was the decision. I mean, and by political, I mean there was, strong political reason to accept Cyprus, regardless the solution of some specific problem, like the frozen conflict. So that's why maybe we need a more, less political, more technical process of negotiation, just because of this problem.
Any more questions?
Can you tell something about the reversible process of Europeanization after the crisis?
Reversal process.
Yes.
Yeah.
De-Europeanization.
De-Europeanization. Yeah. It's like de-democratization.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's Europeanization. It's another topic, and it's very. I don't want to enter in this debate because it's a very complex debate. And what is interesting is that this is another way of thinking about the same problem. In some cases we have, because Europeanization in member states refer above all to implementation of the EU regulation, EU norm, EU legislation. So this is a matter, it's not strictly speaking a democratic issue, it's more, administrative, but it's still a political issue. Also in this situation, I don't know if we can talk about conditionality, the problem of conditionality, because it's very different things. I mean, it's not the same thing that political criteria. It's a very different thing. It concerns, in my opinion, political will and, for instance, administrative structure, administrative culture, and so on. Any more questions?
Not a question, basically, maybe just an observation. I think for me what is lacking is that it's a lot of technical tools and instruments, but if we're talking about a political process, we should definitely include power. And I think when we talk about functionality, we should talk about power.
Can you precise a little more?
Well, when we're talking about different conditions that the different states have to entry, and how some were rushed and some were delayed, and how it also has to be contextualized in moment in time as a key point. So it's this balance of power between
it is, yeah, I can tell you, it is, on the one hand, it's a very asymmetrical process, because, there is family countries that want to speak up more, and there is, member of the club, and there is the club. So, in some way, it's very obvious that you have to accept the requirement.
Sure, just requirements for different countries.
Yeah. But talking about power, there is also another side of the problem. When we consider the Eastern enlargement, it is clear that Eastern enlargement occurred in a specific period, the 2004-2010, and so there were also strong political reasons behind the enlargement. So yeah, power is the definition.
Any more interesting observations or questions? More? Okay. So thank you very much, Dr.